So let's take a look at what we need to know. The final exam, it is 1 week only. It's just like we did with the a midterm. So you have a week to take the exam. It will start on March 16th, that's this Thursday, and run through the 23rd. It's in the same location, so if you took the midterm, you will know where you should be. Okay, the exam closes early on Thursday. I do know that for certain. It closes, I think, at 5 o'clock. I'm not sure, but it closes early on Thursday, so plan accordingly. There'll be no makeup exams, so again, plan accordingly, and do check for Saturday hours. It's always, as I understand it, it's the best time to be there. And it's just as before. It's an objective exam, 50 questions. And study guides are now available on Moodle, so you can download the study guide for the final. I think you will like this study guide for some reason. I'm not sure. I just have a feeling that you will like this one, and it should help you get through the exam. And again, it's the exam is in the instructional testing services. Again, we already mentioned that. If you took the midterm, you know what this is all about because it'll be in the same building and according to the same rules. Remember that you can use, here it says remember to bring your photo ID, and you can use a single 3x5 note card only, just as you did during the midterm. And again, I always emphasize this. I just have to ram it home, and that is be sure to check and verify the hours of the testing lab. And of course, follow the center's rules and requirements. If they want you to remove your hat, remove your hat. If they want you to leave your backpack in a little cubby hole, you do that. All right, moving on. Now it is time for extra credit. If you plan on doing extra credit, it is due March 21st. That's a week from tomorrow at 10:30 in the morning. And if you want to, you can hand deliver it to me. But most of you email it, and that is just fine. If for whatever reason you have to send it through the snail mail, it has to be postmarked no later than March 17th. But I mean, that's kind of old-fashioned now. I get everything through the email, and that's perfectly fine. Okay, what is it then that you need to know to pass the exam? Well, the exam is going to cover everything from the combat film through the edge of Hollywood, and that includes film noir, film in the television age, and so forth. So let's take a look at specifically what you need to know. With regard to the combat or war film, they refer to it as the combat film, and everybody else on the planet calls it a war movie. But if for this one, you need to be well aware, and they emphasize these parts here, the features of the genre. First thing is laws and morality get suspended. Okay, it's just, it's a free-for-all, and everything is for the cause. And number two, this is really an important aspect here, is that it switches from the individual to the group or to the troops. Now, this is significant because up to this point, it has been very much the American phenomenon as exemplified by the Western, in which the individual is the key to everything. You know, it is an individual response to the world. But in the war film, the combat film, that emphasis switches. The individual now is part of a group, and it is usually it's within that small group of troops. It's a brotherhood that is found, and it's one for all and all for one kind of an attitude. So anyway, that's the significance there, is this idea that it does make this switch from what is depicted in the Western. Also, women are emotional, and the emotional element there that brings out male vulnerability. Women sort of have this effect on the soldiers in these films, it has the effect that they become human again. They are killing machines. It's very macho. It is very outgoing. They're very strong, and they're very goal-oriented. But when a woman appears in a war film, suddenly they modify that. And our superhero suddenly becomes a very vulnerable person, and his humanity is brought back to him. Also, the combat war film recognized the anti-war sentiments that are found in post-war films. During the war, of course, it's everything, and when we say the war, we're talking about World War II, that everything is for the cause, and as we'll note in a minute, there's a lot of propaganda there in order to simply win the war. After the war, they start making films that deal with very much the human side, the tragic side of war, and they begin to depict things that otherwise would not have been shown when the war was going on. And also war films and the portrayal of racial integration of the armed forces. Again, that occurs in post-war. It's hard to believe, I know in this day and age, but it was hard to believe that they actually segregated the soldiers, segregated units in the Army. And it wasn't until Truman in, I believe it was 1948, I think, 47 or 48, in which he actually integrated the forces, the armed forces. Okay. The fundamental American philosophy or ideology embedded in the war films is this: we may not always win physically, but we are always right ideologically. So in other words, what we are doing is always right. It's all for the cause. It's for the American way, and we may lose a few battles, but we are always right. Which then brings us to the Office of War Information. Yes, this very much so, the OWI was the government involved in Hollywood film production. It was simply shaping public opinion. Propaganda is always something the other guy does. But we were actually involved in producing propaganda. And the propaganda to be shown overseas, of course, but also to be shown right here domestically. And the whole idea is to shape public opinion. You needed the people behind the fighting units in order to succeed. It was a morale booster. And part of this was depicted in what they call the Sergeant York formula. And this depicts the conversion of an objector to war to one who supports it. And during the war, Gary Cooper won an Academy Award for his portrayal of Sergeant York, which was the true story of that very individual, but that was during World War I. Sergeant York was an objector, and as it gets involved in the war and becomes a great supporter of it. In other words, as a supporter, he becomes the ideological supporter of the war. And the formula worked, because we have a lot of those kind of films that were made during that time that have that very formula. But, you know, the war that nobody wanted, the war in Vietnam, we had lots of films that were made that were anti-Vietnam, and except for John Wayne, who tried one more time to create a film that would boost the morale, at least the morale of the soldiers fighting in Vietnam. And his film was called The Green Berets. It was made in 1968. And what does he do? But he borrows, for one final time, the Sergeant York formula. And in this particular case, it was a newspaper reporter who joined the small group and was determined to expose it for what it was, as baby killers, etc., that kind of stuff that was going on. But yet, while he's in the middle of that war, he turns around and becomes a supporter of it. And so I think that was the swan song. I think we'll probably never see another movie similar to that. Okay, moving on to film noir, everybody's favorite genre. Film noir, it is black film. It's a French term. film noir, because, as it has often been said, Americans made noir, but the French discovered it. And the French discovered it in post-war films. Once the films started being released in Europe, we had these young budding filmmakers, but also these film critics who were producing a magazine that they called Cahiers du Cinéma. And these young people, and their names are very recognizable today, François Truffaut, one of them, and they saw this certain kind of a movie that was out there, a kind of a detective movie, and they described it, and that they noted that it emerged in the 1940s as a reflection of social malaise and economic uncertainty resulting from World War II. And we add this: it is really considered a film movement extending from the early 1940s to the late 1950s. The crime films of this period are noticeably different in theme and style and mood from those made before or after. And it usually starts with The Maltese Falcon, and they bring it up to 1958, where they say it comes to an end in 1958 with Orson Welles' Touch of Evil. So what is it that they saw in these films? Well, let's take a look. First, the settings. The settings for a film noir, always urban. Okay, and the more, the more urbaner you can get, the better. In other words, it's really downtown. It is really the core area of a town. It is what, even their titles of some of these, like the concrete jungle, the steel jungle, those things where it is just nothing, as you can see in that street scene there. It's all synthetic. It's all man-made. There's very little in the way of nature in it. No trees, nothing like that. And it's always rain-slicked streets. It seems to be always that, but at least they notice that in many of the films, the streets are always wet. Creates for some good photographic effects. And again, when we talk about urban and talking about the core area in the main downtown, it's usually that sleazy side of city life. This is where they find all kinds of riffraff. This is where they find drunkards. This is where they find prostitutes. This is where they find drug addicts and so forth, the lost people. Okay, the themes, alienation. Alienation is one of these things in which our characters are all loners. The characters have no friends, seemingly. If they do have friends, they don't trust them. There is also this theme of existentialism, the idea that there's no exit. You'll never get out of this place. Once you're down there, you're there forever, and you just sort of eke out a living. You just simply live from day to day to day. The character types, very often they are amnesiacs. And what I think is one of the greatest of all film noir movies, Detour, it's all about the guy that can't remember much about anything. And it's the same with another film that I also absolutely admire called Black Angel, in which this guy, again, he has no idea where he's been, what's happened, and he's trying to find out who killed his wife. He can't even remember where he was at when she was found dead, and this sort of thing. Okay, we also have, we already mentioned that, the antisocial loners. Usually, we've already mentioned that. They just have no friends. They're very much an individual, very much their own selves. Assertive women, we have women that are just as assertive and aggressive as men, if not more so. Often we see the women in these films that are even tougher, if you can call it that, than the men. And very much they focus on private detectives. It's not police officials. We don't have a detective from headquarters, but we have the private eye, best, I think, exemplified by Sam Spade. In film style, too, because this brings a very much a significant question, which we'll answer later, or at least take a guess at. But it's the film style. They discovered in these films what the French filmmakers or the French critics discovered, this beautiful style that they have. And there are the elements that you see there. It's low-key lighting with lots and lots of shadowy elements. In a lot of the films, you see these, and and for my blood, you can't make a film noir in color. It needs the monochrome. And even a sharp and high contrast film. But in many of these films, you just see parts of a person's face. You have a conversation, they're talking to each other, and as they cut back and forth, what you see is, in some cases, just see a mouth that is moving. There are that's the next point there as well, the strange highlights that are there. And we get extreme camera angles, you know, high and low. It's up angles on people. And distortion, very much. We get what they call a Dutch angle, in which the camera is tilted odd. It's just a different way of seeing. And also be familiar with the production code and film noir, that film noir often alluded to prohibited subjects without directly violating the production code. If they were ever pushing an envelope in Hollywood at this time, it was film noir, because the women in the film were very aggressive and assertive, and they just established themselves, as you see there under gender issues, assertive, if not aggressive, females, and the woman as a femme fatale. It is a woman in complete control of herself that has mastery over men. Okay, which brings us to the question, is it a genre? Is film noir actually a film genre that we can talk about the same as we talk about a Western? Or is it a mode of filmmaking? And we say a mode of filmmaking in which they're saying we purposely select black and white film, we purposely do Dutch angles, we purposely make rain-slick streets, we do all of these strange highlights with light, you know, and we end up just saying it's a mode of filmmaking. And if we say that, then we can say a film like Citizen Kane is film noir, because Citizen Kane has a lot of those characteristics. Or is it a general sensibility? For my blood, the way I look at it, and this is free because it's not going to be part of the exam, but I really think it's a general sensibility. I just think you have a feeling for it. You go to a film and you see these things and you see these characters and you see the interaction involved in it, and you just say, gosh, this is very noirish. It's a very black film. It's very, you know, with a lot of alienation. It's kind of that kind of thing. So I think it's a general sensibility, but that's just me. Okay. In summary then, it is film noir, according to our video series, is a social commentary on post-war reality, and specifically, it's a commentary on the modern mass American culture, mass culture being everything, you know, well, you all know what that means, you know, our mass media as such. Consumerism, that is buying and buying and buying and still buying. And a disillusionment with Paradise Lost, a disillusionment with the Western. What was promised in the Western disappears in film noir. Then we move on to film in the television age. There is a post-war decline in attendance. It is one of those very unusual things that occurs. In 1946, we had the highest percentage of people attending movie theaters in existence. More people went to the movies in 1946 than at any other time, and that even includes today, when we adjust for the inflation and all that kind of stuff on the criteria that you use to measure this. But it was 1946. In 1947, it declined to the worst time. So there is a decline in movies. We don't know why exactly. One of those is the threat of television. Yes, very much so. After the war, television is now free to expand. It was starting to expand in the 1930s, but the war intervened and it had to be put on hold. The war is over, so television expands. But television is not the only culprit. I mentioned this at the very beginning during our orientation session, that it's the post-war era. Also, we had more leisure time, and we had more money. The economy was great, and we had other interests besides movies that were catching our attention. And the America's favorite pastime at that time was, believe it or not, bowling. And we have migration to the suburbs. This is where we get the proliferation of drive-in theaters at this time, because they are leaving the downtown area, that film noir area, and they're living in suburbs. And so you don't have that easy access to downtown movie theaters. Okay, as television, though, takes over, there are agreements between the motion picture industry and TV. And essentially, TV becomes a subsidiary market for motion pictures. This is really, it gets its boost, actually, from two people that are really, you think of mostly with movies, and that is David O. Selznick and Walt Disney. They're the ones that start working with television, but for Disney's part of it, he discovered that he could make a lot of television shows that promote his movies. Okay, the movie industry responds to television and the declining audiences through technical innovations. They decide that you can see things and hear things in movie theaters that you cannot get at home with television. You get third dimension. Things start coming at you. You get horizon-spanning widescreen. And the sound comes at you from all sides, forwards, backwards, and to the sides. So how does this work? With 3D. 3D had been around for quite some time already, but it was not something that was very viable. But it is used to a very great success with what they call natural vision, for a low-budget movie called Buona Devil, made by a guy who is known mostly for making radio programs. It worked this way. With Polaroid lenses, you have two projectors running with those Polaroid filters, and you have compensating filters in glasses that they gave you, and you're able to see things come right off the screen at you. Another thing that they developed was Cinerama, which was a very wide screen. And this gave you a sort of peripheral vision. You sat in the theater, so the screen kind of came around to the sides of you, so you saw things out of the corner of your eye. Now, this was very expensive, and as you can see here in this diagram, the entire movie was shot with 3 cameras in that kind of setup. And again, it was 3 projectors at a huge theater like that was projecting to create that large curved screen so that you got that effect. And it was quite an effect because it also involved all of the extra speakers that gave you a very wide, varied stereophonic sound. So if that rocket speedboat that you see there comes from the left, you hear it coming from the left, and it moves all the way to the right, and the sound just follows the boat. So it was quite the impressive thing. Well, not everybody could make those films because it's so expensive, and not every theater could do that because it involved a complete overhaul of the theater. But they still liked widescreen, so Fox created CinemaScope. And CinemaScope is what's known as anamorphosis. It is the anamorphic squeeze in which a lens, a very wide-angle lens, squeezes the information onto a strip of film. And again, the same lens on a projector unsqueezes it as such and gives you that wide angle. CinemaScope originally had some problems with it because of the lenses and the distortion, and it took a process, and our video series talks about that, called Panavision, which made it into what it is today, made it into a very stable widescreen process. Panavision was simply a lens. It had already been used by Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer as camera 65, but the lenses were so better at recording things that it became the standard, and CinemaScope disappeared. and everything was then shot in Panavision. And in order to do that, the man, Gottschalk was the name of the fellow that developed this lens. He created his own little movie, and it was filmed in Panavision 35, Technicolor, and Panasound, all of those nice technical things, in order to show it off. And he was very successful, because even though it was a very minor league B-type movie, the technical side of it was so impressive that Hollywood pretty much adapted or adopted that as its standard. Okay, technical modifications. Remember, the series talks about this as well. The panning, scanning, and letterboxing, safe action area, and so forth. Be aware of that, because they had to do something if you're going to show a movie on television. What do you do with widescreen? And they did that pan and scan thing, which used to just drive me crazy. I am so thankful for widescreen and for letterboxing so that you can see the entire image. Also, the creative innovations by independent producers. In particular, what we have at this era is American International Pictures and their teenage market. They discovered that in the 1950s, there were more teenagers, young people going to movies than any other group. And also, you know, what was big in the 1950s, monsters. And also big, making low-budget pictures, that you could get away with making low-budget pictures because people went to they flocked to see those. And there were independent producers, and you could make a movie for a song, make it, you know, for $75,000 and end up making, you know, a couple of million. You're doing all right. Also, we move into the 1960s. That's the transition. The older generation has nice, sexy movies like Lover Come Back, which is completely innocent today. And the modern world in 1968, we see The Graduate with the younger generation. I'm not going to go through all of that, but the film school generation, their culture is pretty much there, including the whole idea of the 60s counterculture movement. The Vietnam again, you know, the ideological war, Vietnam, and a generational war. It's the baby boomers versus conservative elders. The social political upheaval of the era with JFK's assassination, Johnson being reelected, MLK is assassinated, Robert Kennedy is assassinated, university protests, all of that kind of stuff. And of course, the women's liberation movement, which led to the sexual revolution, which allowed movies to show whatever they want to. And then you get to images of women, they're either virgins or whores, images of youth, half-baked ideas. I'm not going to go through all of that other than to just mention blaxploitation. That's a very short-lived cycle of black movies that were action movies. And then also just to mention the MPA rating system then and now, that even though we didn't have any censorship, we still have censorship today in the sense that you get rated for whatever it is you put on the screen. Let's see, I don't need to go through all of that. You can find that on the study guide, which brings us to the edge of Hollywood. Be familiar with modern filmmakers and examples of their works. And for this, our course, modern filmmakers are Lucas, Spielberg, Scorsese, but also the filmmakers that were on the fringe, such as Julie Dash. And one thing to remember is that a movie just ain't a movie anymore. And I don't want to go, I'm not going through all of that. And then the new media, what we have today. It's the growth of the home viewing audience and the effect on the movie industry. What it means, new media are key subsidiary outlets for motion pictures, and as such are critical to movie industry success. We have gone from vertical control, from, 10 weeks ago, we talked about vertical control to horizontal control. It is that diversification of the film industry and all of the merchandising that goes with a movie. And, of course, the whole idea of synergy. And that brings us to the end. And just to remind you, yes, photo ID you bring with you, 1 3x5 note card. The exam closes early on Thursday. Your extra credit is due Tuesday. And by 10, and take the exam early if you can. That is it. We made it. And good luck. And I hope you really enjoyed the course. And we'll see you next time. Bye.